How you doing, everyone? This is Mike back with another edition of Sociology 217, Correcting and Controlling Behavior. I'm coming to you live from a beach. It's pretty windy here, so my hair might get a little messed up, but I hope that's okay with you. Have a special treat today. We have a guest who will be joining us, so that'll be fun. And I'll play the video of that guest in the middle of this class. So hopefully that's useful for you. Just wanted to say, I hope everyone is doing as well as can be expected. Let me know if there are any issues in terms of access or ability to concentrate or really anything. I know that this situation, again, is really unique and strange. And so I'm aware of that, and my goal is just to work together and make sure that we have as much flexibility as possible, while also ensuring that we still provide as good of education as possible. So what I'm going to do then is share my screen. And so what we're doing in this class section is we're going to be covering risk assessment in corrections, okay? And risk assessment is a kind of a catch-all phrase that means several different things. But basically, it's the use of data to analyze how likely someone is to engage in some sort of antisocial behavior. That's basically what it boils down to. And so it could be a new crime, it could be misbehavior in prison, or a couple different things. But we'll talk about sort of the history of risk assessment in corrections, different types of risk assessment in corrections, and where we are right now. But first, since today's class is Wednesday, April 1st, I want to talk a little bit about April Fool's Day. I know there's April Fool's Day is one of those holidays. I guess you could call it a holiday. Holiday really means holy day. It's not really a holy day, but I'm not really sure what else you'd call it. As I say here, I think it's a great day. And it seems to me that there's a lot of division in terms of what people think about April Fool's Day. Either you love it or you hate it. But no, people don't really stop to think about, well, how long have we had April Fool's Day? It's been around for a while, but where did it start? The History channel at history.com has some really interesting background, and they're not really sure, but one possibility is that it comes down to when the French switched to the Gregorian calendar in 1582. There were a bunch of people who didn't know that the calendar had switched, and so they thought that the year was beginning in April rather than the beginning in January, where it does now, and so they were kind of made fools of and made fun of. Another is this festival Hilaria in ancient Rome. That's another possibility where people dressed up and did some silly things. Really, though, it took off in Great Britain in the 1700s, the 18th century. People really had a lot of fun pranking each other, making jokes, and so on and so forth. And maybe it's because, you know, this is the beginning of spring and people are getting outside and they're just happy and goofy. I'm not sure. But there's some really interesting ones, some famous pranks you might have heard of. 1957, the BBC ran a story that showed a new type of tree that was being grown, and it grew spaghetti, cooked spaghetti even. And there was a video of it. I have a link here if you're interested, where it showed people harvesting spaghetti from spaghetti trees, and it fooled a lot of people. In 1986, Sports Illustrated ran an article on this mythical pitcher named Sid Finch. It's a really interesting story, and it fooled that fooled a lot of people. And every year, you know, there's different things that companies do to prank us, and typically we don't fall for it anymore. But I think it can be a fun day. I know a lot of people don't like to be pranked or made a fool of, but as long as it's lighthearted and in the good spirit, I think April Fool's Day is an interesting take on a holiday. So what we're going to be covering this week, risk assessment and corrections. So from the textbook, we only read 23 and 28. Those are articles that cover the level of service inventory. And the first one is by Andrews and Bonta, who came up with the level of service inventory, and it's a little bit on their take on the history of risk assessment. And then this article by Gottfredson and colleague, it's not really Gottfredson at all, but it's another piece on some pitfalls with risk assessment in corrections. And then for Friday, but we'll cover them in this video, there's some work that I've done with Grant Dewey, and then with Judy Plummer-Beal at the Maine Department of Corrections, and then this really interesting piece by Baird in 2009 that's pretty critical of risk assessment in criminal justice. So we'll be talking about the level of service inventory revised. This is the name of a risk assessment tool. It's a very popular tool. A lot of departments across the country use it. And it is part of, we've talked about this, the risk need responsivity paradigm. So the Canadian School of Criminology, the social learning psychologist developed this entire approach. So that's what we'll be covering in this video. Okay, so what is risk assessment? Risk assessment is used across the criminal justice system at a variety of different levels. It could be used to guide sentencing, and to guide appropriate, should someone go to prison, for how long, for example. One of the things that we talked about early in the semester when we talked about philosophies of punishment and particularly incapacitation was this idea that if we could identify the really high risk offenders, the people who, the very, very small percentage, about 5%, who are responsible for a huge amount of criminal behavior, if we could identify those folks and selectively incapacitate them, then we would, for a small effort, we would reduce a huge amount of crime. The numbers are about 5% of the population, 50% of all the crimes. It's been a difficult thing to do. Some have argued that you can't really identify the really high rate offenders until they've already become high rate offenders. But risk assessment is a possibility that we could potentially use to identify them before they're high risk. Now, think about the ethical implications of that. You get a risk assessment tool. It says you're going to be a high rate offender. You haven't actually been a high rate offender yet. And so you get a really harsh, long sentence. That could affect some of your constitutional rights, I would imagine. How do we assess risk and what do we do with it? In corrections, what do we do? Well, risk is assessed in a couple different ways. It's usually done as soon as somebody comes into the correctional system. They are given a risk assessment, and that can be to guide where they're placed, their custody. That can be used to determine what type of treatment they should get, where they should be put in the prison in terms of you don't really want to mix high risk offenders with low risk offenders. And then it could also be used to drive parole decisions. So ideally what you would see is that you would have a risk assessment tool that would identify high risk offenders. Those are the ones that you really want to concentrate on. You want to focus your resources on the people who are at most risk for reoffending and give them the treatment or the resources that they need to do better. If someone is a low risk offender, they don't have a high risk of reoffending once they're released, then there's really not that much of a need to spend a lot of resources on helping them, right? They're going to do fine as it is, okay? So risk assessment history, there's these generations. Andrews and Bonta talk about these different generations, 4 generations of risk assessment. In the first generation, it's basically our gut instincts, clinical judgment. You have professionals who are maybe studying a case and saying, this person is high risk and that person is not high risk. Clinical judgment there's some use for it. For example, there might be somebody who scores low risk on a risk assessment, but a professional, sorry about that. But the professional, maybe a psychologist, notices something in their file that makes them think that they're maybe a little bit more high risk. That's something that might not come through in a risk assessment tool. And so it could be valuable, but for the most part, these clinical judgments do not perform as well. They don't predict recidivism or outcomes as well as tools. Second generation tools, these are actuarial tools, and they are basically comprised of lists of what are called static risk factors, so things that don't change. So how many times have you been arrested in the past? Have you been convicted of a violent felony? These types of things. those questions tend to predict future behavior pretty well, much better than clinical judgment. The third generation then includes more theoretically informed measures and then dynamic measures. These are things that could change over time. So attitudes, for example. And then the fourth generation, where we are now, includes static dynamic factors and then really focuses on a case plan. So it's used as in a holistic way to help drive how the individual is treated throughout the system. The dominant paradigm in risk assessment is this risk need responsivity approach. We've talked about this, the R&R approach. Again, the idea is that you need to assess risk and then focus on the high risk offenders. You need to identify criminogenic needs. These are areas that are in deficit that you can address with programming treatment. And then you also need to pay attention to the responsivity, the learning styles, culture, so on and so forth of each individual's. The Canadian psychologists focus on social learning and personality. They think this is the most important thing that we need to focus on in terms of assessing risk. We don't want to pay attention to IQ or self-esteem or things like that that don't really have much to do with somebody's risk of reoffending. And they also develop the principles of effective intervention. So there are these principles that they say if you stick to them, then when people go to prison or in some sort of correctional program, they will come out improved. Okay, so the risk need assessment, this is the big 8. The first 4 here are called the big 4. These are the ones that you want to really focus on. History of antisocial behavior. This is static. So how much have you been involved in antisocial behavior in the past? Antisocial personality pattern, adventurous, pleasure-seeking, self-control, so on and so forth. And so there's some needs that go along with that, antisocial cognitions and then antisocial peers. So these are the ones that they think are really important to focus on. And then the little 4 here, family, school, leisure and recreation, and substance abuse. These are the things that are included in their risk assessment tool, the level of service inventory. All right, so just some terms, dynamic versus static. What do we mean by that? Static factors are those that typically don't change, but and also can't really be targeted by treatment. So age, race, gender, criminal history. So if you have a really high rate of past criminal behavior, there's not really a treatment program that you can be involved with that will reduce that. Dynamic factors are things that can change: antisocial personality, substance use, mental health, things that you could see a change from time 1 to time 2. In other words, you have a substance use issue, you go to AA, and then your substance use issue is ameliorated after that. Risk factors should include both dynamic and static. So what are we talking about with risk assessments? The goal is to predict either recidivism or some other outcome, maybe misbehavior in prisons, but also to reduce them, right? So risk assessments, first and foremost, need to be tools that once you have done the tool, once you have filled it out on a person and a group of people, is actually statistically related to their behavior. So in other words, the higher the risk, the more likely that person is to engage in the outcome, maybe recidivism. So that's one way of determining whether a tool is actually useful. So we want it to predict recidivism, but at the same time, these tools are supposed to be used to guide treatment, right? So in other words, you do a risk assessment when people come into a prison, and then you identify the high-risk people, and then you focus on them, and you identify what needs they have. And if you've done that work well, then once they get out, then those risks should have been mitigated, should have been ameliorated, and so they're no longer high risk. So the risk assessment at the beginning of their prison term maybe shouldn't actually be what their risk is when they leave, and shouldn't actually predict recidivism. So what I'm saying here in the second point is that a good tool should not predict recidivism, because if it's actually doing its job, then it should kind of level the playing field so that everybody is at sort of a lower risk once they leave prison. And so just because they were high risk at the beginning doesn't mean they're more likely to commit a new crime because they have been given what they need. I hope that makes sense. But we can talk about it in the chat room. So a couple things that we want to pay attention to is when we assess assessment tools, validity and reliability is what we look at. Validity is the extent to which a tool measures what it's intended to, risk. So the way that we do that is we say, does a tool, when we have scores, do higher scores predict more recidivism? And then reliability is to the extent to which the tool is consistent. So if a tool has 10 different questions, and they're all assessing different elements of risk, then they should be highly correlated. This is called inter-rater. This is called alpha or consistency, internal consistency. Okay. Another type of consistency is across raters, inter-rater reliability. So if the tool is done well, then and people are trained to use the tool, then they should use the tool in a similar way. In other words, they look at an individual inmate, and two people using a good tool should come to the same level of risk. So that if they do, then it's reliable. Okay. The Andrews and Bonta reading, they developed the LSIR. It's gone through different iterations. They mentioned that it's effective. It predicts recidivism. They also say that correctional programs that adhere to the R&R approach are more effective in reducing recidivism. And one tool that I think is pretty interesting, I was actually trained on this tool at the University of Southern Maine, the CPAI, Correctional Program Assessment Inventory. It's a really involved tool that involves observation and interviews and case reviews that assesses program adherence to this R&R approach and the principles of effective intervention. And the more a program adheres to their overall theory, research has shown the more it reduces recidivism. So I remember I went to a program or a women's reentry center, and I spent a couple days, walking through the halls and talking to people and going through case files and basically scoring this CPAI to see how well it was doing. The LSIR, this is the big tool. This is the one that's used across North America. We've got 54 items or questions, and they are broken down into 8 domains. You basically get an overall score, and the higher the score, the more risk. A lot of times, different departments will what's called norm the instrument to their own population, and so they'll look at overall scores, and they'll create categories: high risk, medium high risk, medium low risk, so on and so forth. The LSIR is oftentimes administered by trained staff. And they use a variety of sources. They may talk to the person. They might look at their offense record, so on and so forth. They try to verify whether they had a job when they were arrested or not. It's generally pretty good at predicting recidivism, especially the people who develop the tool say that it does. There are some questions about whether it applies to non-Canadian, right? It's a Canadian tool, non-Canadian populations, and then non-white male populations. So one of the readings looked at African American and Hispanics and found that actually the tool doesn't work very well. It doesn't predict recidivism with this non-white male group. Also, some people have questioned whether it works for women. I remember for the Maine Department of Corrections, we did some work that showed that there is a little bit of a difference, but it does seem to work for women as well. There's one big paper where the LSIR people, or there's also a group of researchers in the University of Cincinnati who are heavily involved in this, and they found that overall it works pretty well for women. But let's be critical about risk assessment for a minute. The Baird reading, I think, is really interesting. And the argument is that we've kind of just gone full bore evidence-based programming and risk assessments in corrections, and we haven't really paid too much attention to the evidence. We haven't really critically examined it. And so he starts off by saying, the LSIR, 54 items, that's too many. There's a lot of items, there's a lot of questions that don't really have much to do with recidivism, and it's not clear why they're there. They also argue that risk and need should not be combined. So basically the LSIR is one tool that gets at risk and also identifies needs. So they argue, Baird argues this should be two different tools. And then most of the time when we're looking at risk assessment tools, we're looking at validity. Validity meaning, does it predict recidivism? And say, if it does, well, it's a good tool. But we don't really spend a lot of time on reliability. Particularly, we don't look at ratings across different staff members. Now, the reason is because again, there's limited resources. It's not often going to be the case that you have more than one staff member scoring a tool on the same inmate. That would be a waste of resources. So we just don't have a lot of information on whether people score the tool similarly, right? And then there's a little evidence that the tools actually impact outcomes. In other words, if a good tool should reduce recidivism because it's used appropriately, but there's not much evidence there. In terms of the LSIR, one of the readings that I wanted you to take a look at was one that that I wrote before I came to Bates, and it was looking at reliability. And so the issue is there are a lot of questions on the on the LSIR. Does the inmate or the person have antisocial attitudes? Well, I might say yes, you might say no. It's kind of subjective. So how do you score that? So one of the things that we did, me and my friend here, was we set up an experiment. We set up a study where we decided to we would have to basically assess whether the tool is rated consistently across groups in a an artificial format, right? Because we're not going to have multiple people assessing the same inmates. So what we did was, for the juvenile and the adult side, the juvenile uses what's called the Youth Level of Service Case Management Inventory. This is the youth version of the LSIR. So we did it for both youth and for adults. And so what I did was I took somebody who was considered a seasoned or a well-trained rater, somebody who's used this tool a lot, and I had them go through the instrument with 10 adults. So I went to the prison and I had them sit down for a set amount of time with this interviewer, and I videotaped it. Okay, so I set up a video camera, hit record, left the room for privacy reasons. They went through the risk assessment tool and did that for 10 people, and then I invited. I have to download this apparently. Sorry about that. So here's the paper that came out of this. So then we took 20 raters, people who actually fill out the risk assessment. So we had 10 from people who worked in the prison system, and then 10 who worked in community. So probation officers. So we had 20 raters all get into a room and watch the videos and fill out the form. Okay, so if you picture it, they all were looking at the same interview questions, the same answers, and if the tool is reliable, then they all should come up with the same scores. Okay, so then we assessed it, and we looked at for the adults, right? What's the how much did they differ across raters? So for prisoner one, there was an absolute deviation score of 2.24 for the risk assessment tool. Here's a little bit easier to understand. These are the 8 domains here that we just talked about. So here's the percent agreement in terms of high or max, right? So 84% of the 20 raters said that they were either high or max or not, and they agreed upon that. So on and so forth. So you see some variation. 84% is pretty good. 68% for companions. I mean, that again, or these are high. Companions, 68% is not really that high. So that's a little bit troubling. But overall, we found that the tool was generally pretty reliable, but some of the parts of the tool were not as reliable as others. And then we did the same thing for juveniles. The LSIR, again, predicts risk and needs. So what about needs? Well, here's another paper that I had worked on in the past. With my colleague Grant Dewey. And we call this a jack of all trades, but master of none. So using Minnesota data, because he's the research director in Minnesota, what we did was we looked at the LSIR in Minnesota, and we found it didn't do very well. But the thing that we wanted to know was, if the LSIR is supposed to assess risk but also need, then if it assesses someone as high need in terms of substance use, and then they go to a substance abuse program, does that mean that they have lower recidivism than someone who didn't have that type of guiding treatment, right? Someone who went to substance abuse treatment but didn't have a substance use problem, or someone who had substance use problem but didn't have treatment. So just to look at what we see here, we see overall performance of the domains again, not so great, but all right. And AUC, this is a technical term of 6.628, is okay but not great. Down to the interesting results here, it's kind of hard to see, but overall, if someone has an educational problem that's identified in the risk assessment tool, and then they go to education, they have an education treatment in prison, then do they do better, right? And so we looked at that. There's a lot of findings here. Overall, we found that there's some support that the tool is useful in assessing and guiding need, but not a lot of evidence for that. Some problems with risk assessment. Again, a big one that I want to talk about is bias. There's a huge concern on the part of some groups that risk assessment tools are biased, that it will show that non-white males have a higher risk, and that's a function of societal issues and so on and so, and so they're treated differently. Grant and I just did a paper that showed that the risk assessment tools work well for a bunch of different groups, but that doesn't really necessarily get at bias. There also is more evidence that's needed. There's a lot of different risk assessment tools out there, and we need to know which ones work best. There's also the problem of cost, actually, is a big one. So the LSIR is used at multiple different stages throughout the correctional system, and for each person that comes into the system. And it costs, last time I checked it in Maine, it costs about $1 every time you use it. So if you have thousands and thousands of people coming through and they're being assessed multiple times, it adds up pretty good. And then this idea of home field advantage, what does that mean? Well, if a tool is built and developed on a population that's not the one that you're in charge of, does it do as well? And so Grant and I also did a paper or a study where we looked at this, and I'll show you the results here. So with respect to sex offending, so again, you can have risk assessments that are general. You can have some that deal with sex offending, particular different populations. So what we did was we found that the Minnesota tool that Grant developed does better than this kind of general tool that's made for predicting sex offending risk. It does better in Minnesota. It's a tool that was built in Minnesota than the more general one. We also looked at professional judgment, and we found that professional judgment using overrides actually makes the predictive performance worse. So here's just another paper that we did. But one thing that I also wanted to do was to take a look at this paper that Grant and I did in terms of cost. So go back to my projects, and sorry about going through all this. Go to my Grant folder, Grant Dewey. So what we did in this paper was Grant was looking at automating a risk assessment tool. So the LSIR can take up to an hour or more for people to fill out. So not only does it cost money to do, but it also is it takes a lot of time. So can you develop a tool that is automated in the sense that you could push a button and it will give a risk score to people? So that's one thing that we were looking at here, that he's developed this tool that does allow you to do that, and it saves a lot of money, right? So one of the things that we found here was every dollar spent on automation, the expected return is $4.35, and as much as $21.75. So you're saving a lot of money. We also found here that we looked at the relationship between reliability and validity, and we found, which you might expect, more reliability. A tool that has more reliability has better predictive validity. So that's another thing that we took a look at here. So one thing I want to do before we wrap up here is just let's see if we can get Grant up here to tell us a little bit about risk assessment and his experience with it. And so I visited with him earlier today, and I'm going to try to play this video.